Welcome back to the We See Monsters channel. On today's episode, we are going to visit our friends up north in Canada for some spooky encounters. The first story involves a Wendigo, which I don't believe I have covered yet. Wendigos are a terrifying cryptid that originated from the native tribes around the Great Plains and Great Lakes region in the northernmost part of the States and into Canada. They are said to be human and beast hybrids with antlers. I'm not entirely too sure what cryptid is in the second story, but it kind of sounds like it could be a mimic. I've heard many stories about mimics stalking people in the woods. Nonetheless, let's buckle up for this week's encounters. The following story was told by an anonymous user on a forum for Wendigo encounters. This is not my story, but rather my papa's. A couple of years ago, he and I were talking about going hiking in Algonquin Park, somewhere that he had been many times before and had grown up near. Unfortunately, his health was failing and our trip was canceled. He told me that it was likely for the best, since he wouldn't be able to protect me from the Wendigo if we saw it. My papa is half First Nations, but because his mother was removed from her home as a child and placed into the schools, she lost her status as First Nations and wasn't allowed to live on the res. But she lived just outside of it, near Algonquin Park. Papa has many friends who lived on the res and would often go with them into the park to hike and hunt when he was a young man. They saw many strange things in the deepest parts of the forest. However, this is a story he shared with me that day. Papa was hiking with a friend, let's call him Ben, when they were in their late 20s. They had already been out in the park for several days, camping at nightfall and continuing in the morning, and were rather deep in the woods. It was late October and getting colder as the days went on, but they were prepared for that and often camped in the dead of winter. One night, as the temperature dropped below freezing, they decided it was time to set up camp and start a fire. They were starting to gather wood when Papa heard something. It was the crying of a baby or a small child. Papa had grown up during the Great Depression and had heard stories of people abandoning unwanted babies and children in the forest. He started to follow the crying when Ben grabbed his arm. "Don't go over there, John. It's not what you think it is," Ben said, looking a little pale. "We should move our camp, or that thing will just keep wailing and getting closer." Papa was confused, not understanding what his friend meant. But what if it's someone in need? What if it's the kid of another camper who got lost? He broke free from his friend's hand. "I can't leave until I check it out." Ben sighed, but agreed, loading his hunting rifle and telling Papa to do the same before they went to check it out. The forest was in twilight now as they moved towards the crying. As they broke through a thick patch of trees, they came to an old campsite, and there laying on the ground was a child that looked to be no older than a year. Papa started towards it, but Ben stopped him, telling him to wait. As Papa looked back, the child began to change. It stood up, the legs under it growing long and bent as if it had two sets of knees, each bending in different directions. Its arms were much the same, with 2 elbows per arm, one bending forward and one back. Its torso grew to the size of a large man, but its ribs were protruding, as if threatening to tear through the skin. And its head grew to the size of a man's, with its large mouth taking up most of its face. Its jaw unhinged and it let out another round of crying, as if to draw them even closer. Ben began to chant, and the beast screamed as if in pain before running off. Knowing that this was not going to be the easy meal it wanted, Papa was frozen on the spot. What was that, Ben? That, John, was a Wendigo. It was the spirit of a person who became lost in these woods and starved. Over time, the spirit became twisted and evil. You must never approach one without protecting yourself first. Now, let's go move the camp. This is its hunting grounds, and it will be back. Papa is now in his late 80s, and every time he tells this story, he looks terrified. He is now palliative, meaning his days are numbered, and he has asked me to take his ashes to the park, as he did with Ben's, and scatter them in the woods. But he reminded me not to go alone, lest I come face to face with the Wendigo. This last story was told by a Reddit user who also frequents Algonquin Park and came across an unknown humanoid creature while exploring the area alone. This is their story. I'm a school teacher from Barry's Bay, Ontario. Thanks to my summers off, I spend almost half of each August going on canoe trips in Algonquin Park nearby. Most of the park isn't wilderness by any means, as there are many logging roads. There are, however, many areas of the park that are protected and have no logging or infrastructure, and these are the areas I like most. Some of these areas are huge, bigger than most of the other parks. This August, I went on a solo trip to the lake to catch some trout. It wasn't exactly the season for them, as most lake trout stay in very deep water during the summer. But I was going to have a busy fall, and figured, why not attempt some deep water fishing? The trip began through the access point at the lake. It had branching arms that act as a popular canoe highway for backcountry access. Over the course of a few days, I made my way from Opiongo to Dixon Lake, across one of the longest portages in the park. The lake was beautiful. When you first come across from Dixon, you enter a bay, and as you continue on your way, it opens up to this massive lake that felt like a small sea to a guy like me who has never seen the ocean. Since this lake is very deep into the backcountry, you normally don't see many other campers. However, one of the only other canoe trippers there happened to take my favorite site on one of the islands. Because of that, I decided to try something new and camp on the lake's northernmost site. I set up camp and went fishing. It was extremely windy, so it was difficult to control my canoe. This is less of an issue when I have the weight of all my gear in the boat, but I had already set up camp. I decided to call it an early evening and went back to shore before the winds blew me to the other side of the lake. I then had an idea. I was relatively close to a much smaller lake to the north end of my site, connected by a very short and nearby passage. I grabbed my rod and a few small spinners and decided to head over to see if I could catch some perch or panfish from shore. It was getting late, so I wouldn't be there for long. I made my way up to find it connected to a very marshy area. I went back and around the marsh, which took a lot longer than expected. I started casting from shore just as night fell, not wanting to head back because of how long it took me to get there. It was getting a little nippy out, so I buttoned up my flannel. The lake was beautiful with the cold wind. That moment of beauty was quickly interrupted by the sound of crunching to my right. The only animals that make sounds like that as they move are bears and moose. Both are creatures that you don't want to bother. The issue was that this animal was in between me and the rest of the shoreline that would have guided me back to the marsh, and thus the portage, and thus my campsite. I decided I would cut across the dense forest to the shore and find my campsite. I was glad I brought my flashlight because at this point, it was very dark. I made my way into the forest, and after about 15 seconds, I heard the animal again. I stopped moving and heard it continue for a second before pausing itself. When I continued, it continued, and when I stopped, it stopped. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. I was shining my flashlight behind me, but couldn't see any reflecting eyes shining back at me. I swear, I was just standing there with my flashlight for 2 minutes. I started speed walking, shining my light back periodically in a slight panic. I didn't want to be eaten by what I thought was a mountain lion or a bear. I finally tried scaring whatever it was off by yelling. I turned around and yelled, "Hey, back off," as if I was calling out to someone. My entire world shattered when whatever it was shouted back, "Hey, back off," in my exact voice. Now, this next part is going to sound absolutely crazy, but then I saw a bald white head with no ears and huge eyes looking out from behind a tree, and I absolutely bolted through the woods away from it until I reached water. From there, I ran along the shore until I reached my campsite, and I threw everything in my canoe as fast as possible. I picked up my tent with my sleeping bag and everything in it and just threw it in the canoe. I grabbed my backpack and water filter and threw them in as well. I got in and paddled as fast as I could, completely forgetting to get my bear hang. I had no idea where I was going, but my instincts were telling me to just leave. I found myself sitting in my canoe in the pitch black, not knowing where on the lake I was at that moment. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my canoe until morning. I had the balls to head back to my site and quickly grabbed my bear hang before canoeing to the other side of the lake where I would properly fold and put away my gear. I will never camp there again. For more spooky content, you can click the links below to check out my TikTok and listen to the We See Monsters podcast.